110 years after the sinking of the original Titanic, a second replica of the famous ship, called Titanic 3, is on its way to the wreckage site of the original Titanic. Television reports that everyone is eagerly anticipating the voyage of this Titanic replica, which will sail the same route as the original and stop at the site where the Titanic sank. Captain RHS is briefing his team about the ship and the significance of its maiden voyage. When asked about its true purpose, he appears tense and secretive. After the briefing, Titanic 3 finally sets sail, with VIP passengers standing on the deck, celebrating their departure into open waters, heading toward the greatest adventure of their lives. A well-known influencer couple, Mia and Jackson Stone, are live streaming to share their adventure with followers who couldn't join them. During the stream, Mia mentions a book titled The Wreck of the Titan, which was written 14 years before the original Titanic set sail. The host, Julie McCoy, activates her microphone to welcome the passengers of Titanic 3 and share information about the ship, as well as what they will do upon reaching the site of the infamous disaster. Meanwhile, in the cargo hold, a woman named Adina Bess, who had secretly boarded the ship, emerges from her hiding spot among the luggage. She grabs her belongings and begins making her way through the ship. Passing by other passengers, she steals a uniform from one of the rooms and disguises herself as a crew member. She makes her way to the ship's museum, where artifacts from the Titanic wreck are stored and displayed. She takes a violin out of its glass case. As she stands there holding the violin, Professor Hal Cochran, the chief technical advisor for the expedition that discovered the Titanic wreck, becomes furious and protective. He quickly places the violin back in its case and mocks Adina, ranting about how much more important the violin is compared to her. The violin is the very one that played nearer, "My God, to Thee," the final song performed as the Titanic sank. Adina ignores his insults and notices a hairpin that resembles one her grandmother used to own. She also reacts strangely upon seeing a silver ring worn by Professor Hal, mocking him. She accuses the professor of stealing items from the victim's final resting place. Professor Hal defends himself, claiming that he didn't steal the artifacts, but preserved them to keep the victim's memories alive. Adina then brings up the ancient Egyptians, who were buried with their household belongings, and warns that those who stole or even touched their personal treasures were cursed. Professor Hal grows increasingly angry at her remarks. As Julie enters and asks Adina to leave, while she calms Professor Hal, unbeknownst to both the professor and the cruise ship host, Adina steals the hairpin along with the coin and letter that were with it, before returning to the cargo hold. Mia and Jackson are streaming and showing themselves wandering around the ship, when Jackson suddenly bumps into Professor Hal. Professor Hal, angry, berates Jackson for being too absorbed in his vlogging to pay attention to where he's going. However, his anger softens when he sees Mia, who shamelessly flirts with Professor Hal in front of her husband. The couple feels awkward and quickly walks away to find their cabin. Still streaming, the couple struggles to find their cabin and eventually asks the ship's security officer, Brian Andrews, for directions. Professor Hal is speaking with a wealthy passenger named Mr. Wick, who is in awe that the professor has seen the Titanic wreck firsthand. Professor Hal explains that everyone involved in the expedition who witnessed the wreckage with their own eyes was given items they salvaged from the site as souvenirs. One of the items Professor Hal owns is a silver wedding ring he wears, with an engraving on the inside that reads Edward and Sarah. Mr. Wick is shocked to learn that the ring once belonged to Captain Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic. Mr. Wick tries to buy the wedding ring, but Professor Hal initially refuses, explaining that the ring is extremely important, not just to him, but also to the captain. However, the tempting promise of money eventually sways Professor Hal, and he offers to sell other items that might interest Mr. Wick instead. The next day, in the cargo hold, Adina takes out a photo of the late Captain Edward Smith and begins performing a ritual with the image, along with a hairpin and a book written in a foreign language. Mia and Jackson, now dressed in formal attire for the party, sneak down to the belly of the ship, where they find Adina, another woman. Nancy, who is a fan of the couple, is watching their stream and decides to follow them to the cargo hold to witness what's happening before her eyes. At first, the three of them are engrossed in watching Adina, but their concern quickly grows as they witness her cutting the palm of her hand and praying for the spirits resting in the depths of the ocean to rise. Adding to the eerie scene unfolding before them, their signal suddenly cuts out, and Jackson attempts to fix it but fails. Fearing being seen by Adina, the three decide to leave quietly. On their way back to their cabin, Jackson runs into Professor Hal again, bumping into him just like before, and is immediately insulted by him. Nancy, feeling uncomfortable with his attitude, walks away, while Mia confronts Professor Hal about his rude behavior, especially since he continues to belittle her. Professor Hal feels no remorse, as he's dealing with a beautiful woman, and even suggests that he's willing to sell artifacts from the museum at a fair price. He subtly encourages the couple to buy his Titanic collection, trying to profit from the suffering of others, while also flirting with Mia and touching her without permission. Finally, Professor Hal leaves. The couple then heads to the party, which begins with a 30-second moment of silence to honor the 1,517 souls lost in the Titanic tragedy. Meanwhile, Adina has completed her ritual, and Captain Edward Smith rises from the dead. It turns out that the original Titanic captain is Adina Bess's great-grandfather. Mia and Jackson resume streaming as the ghost of the Titanic violinist appears, playing Nearer My God to Thee. The drunk couple, unaware of the looming danger, dances along to the music of the Titanic. Suddenly, a loud piercing scream echoes throughout the ship, though it seems only a few people can hear it, while others remain unaware. The sweet moment of the couple is interrupted when Mia feels pain from hearing the sound. She screams in agony, and unknowingly, an invisible force pulls Jackson away. The sound fades, leaving those who heard it confused. The deck crew doesn't understand what happened, but they know the response to the sound shouldn't have been like that. They quickly run a diagnosis on the communication system. The area they are in is suddenly enveloped in thick fog, which the radar detects as a solid object. Parker tries to contact Captain Rads, but there is no response, and he suspects that the fog is causing some sort of electromagnetic interference. Parker decides to go to the party to search for Captain Rads himself, while Mia realizes that Jackson is missing and begins to panic as she searches for him. Seeing Mia in distress and still confused by the previous sound, Professor Hal approaches her and urges her to return to the bar with him, assuring her that Jackson is fine and will likely turn up later. Mia asks Professor Hal to leave first while she grabs her phone, but after he leaves, the ghost of the violinist appears again, moving aggressively and scraping the bow of the violin harshly. This causes Mia to scream in pain before collapsing to the ground, her eyes wide open and motionless. The security team arrives and finds her unconscious. They check Mia but find that she has already passed away, her pulse no longer beating. They decide to report the situation to the captain. The captain, along with Bryant, immediately heads to where Mia's body still lies, and orders Bryant to search for Jackson, while the other security officers are instructed to inspect the entire area. The captain leaves only himself and a security officer named Hector at the scene. Captain RHS asks Hector to access Mia's phone, before eventually leaving him alone with Mia's body, in order to report the possibility of a murder. Hector reviews the CCTV footage, but strangely, none of the cameras captured any events. Nevertheless, he manages to access Mia's phone, and they watch the last video Mia recorded. The video raises more questions than answers, and the only thing they know for sure is that Professor Hal was the last person seen with Mia before her death. Captain and Brian quickly approach Professor Hal, who is currently showing one of the relics to someone in a private area. At first, Professor Hal doesn't take the situation seriously, but his attitude changes when he's informed that Jackson is missing and Mia has died. Captain RHS Brian and Hector, left with no other option, begin accusing Professor Hal, having seen security footage showing an argument between him and the stone couple. Brian is ordered to take Professor Hal to the holding room for further interrogation. When they are alone in the room, it is revealed that Professor Hal and Brian are actually working together. Brian has been helping Professor Hal find clients interested in Titanic relics, and the money earned from selling these relics is split between them. With Jackson's disappearance and Mia's death, Brian sees an opportunity to pressure Professor Hal into increasing his share of the money, in exchange for freedom from the accusations. Professor Hal, in a desperate situation, has no choice but to agree to Brian's demands, though begrudgingly. Afterward, Brian leaves him alone, locked in a room far from others. Meanwhile, Captain RHS returns to the control room and is informed that there is an issue affecting the ship's systems. The engines haven't started, yet the ship is still moving, inadvertently carrying them toward the minefield, a part of the ocean filled with icebergs. On the deck, Julie is seen leading a passenger named Mrs. Strauss, praising the beautiful necklace she is wearing. The necklace is one of the Titanic relics that Mrs. Strauss had purchased from Professor Hal. After Julie leaves the elderly woman alone, the ghost of a woman appears and kills Mrs. Strauss, seemingly angry that Mrs. Strauss is wearing the necklace. Captain RHS and Brian then head to the engine room, where they find the dead body of the engine officer. After inspecting the body, they hurriedly attempt to shut down the engine manually, but fail. The ship's boiler is under immense pressure, and it is only a matter of time before it explodes. Brian suggests that they should evacuate the ship immediately, but Captain RHS refuses, stating that he must first neutralize the ship's throttle to prevent further disaster. A small explosion is muffled in the lower part of the ship, causing concern among everyone, but the captain remains unharmed. Brian quickly returns to the control room. Captain RHS reassures the crew, claiming that the ship has only suffered minor damage and that they will be fine. However, despite his reassurances, their ship has lost power and is drifting toward a massive iceberg. Fortunately, the PA system and communications start working again. Captain RHS reassures the passengers that everything will be fine and calls for the nearest ship, which is about 2 hours away, to provide assistance. Captain RHS is confident that this is just a minor incident and that they will be sailing again soon, unaware of the restless spirits wandering the ship. Meanwhile, Professor Hal is resting in the crew cabin when water begins to leak in. He screams for help, but he's locked inside. The lights go out, and the ghosts begin to torment him. Meanwhile, Nancy, a devoted fan of Mia and Jackson, breaks into the control room to speak with the captain about the couple's live stream. Nancy insists that the light they saw quickly passing across the screen when Mia was attacked was a ghost. She believes the ship is haunted because they are sailing over the graves of thousands of people. Captain RHS calms Nancy down and asks Brian to escort her back to her cabin. Afterward, Brian heads to the crew cabin, where he finds Professor Hal curled up on the floor. Brian takes Professor Hal to see the captain as requested. Professor Hal explained the events he experienced in the crew cabin, but no one believed that he had seen a ghost that appeared to be death itself. The captain then instructed Brian to take Professor Hal back to his cabin. On their way, they saw Adina passing by. Noticing Professor Hal's fear, Adina accused him of being the cause of all the problems happening on the ship. Adina claimed that Professor Hal had stolen her treasure and orchestrated everything to get what he wanted, including killing Mia and Jackson and making them hallucinate about ghosts. Adina simply laughed and denied killing anyone, but hinted that she knew more than she let on. She suddenly revealed that it was actually Professor Hal who was responsible for the deaths. Adina grew angrier as she explained that the Titanic had been cursed since her great-great-grandfather died on the ship. She heard voices growing angrier, disturbed by Professor Hal's disrespectful attitude toward them. Professor Hal finally believed Adina and asked how to stop the curse. However, Adina didn't provide an answer, only saying that Professor Hal's curse was to witness everyone around him die as a result of the horrors he had caused. Brian and Sykes then took Adina away, while other security officers escorted Professor Hal. On the way, Professor Hal and Sykes saw a ghost at the end of the corridor. Terrified, Professor Hal hid, leaving the security of others in the hands of the dead. When he emerged from his hiding spot, the security officers were gone, but the ghost remained. Fearing for his life, he cowardly fled. Meanwhile, Adina was taken to the cabin, where Professor Hal had previously been locked up. There, she revealed that she knew about the deal between Professor Hal and Brian. Brian tried to deny it, but fear began to overtake him, convinced that Adina had indeed called upon dark forces. The door suddenly slammed shut on its own, and the ghost of Captain Edward appeared. Brian, foolishly, fired his gun at the ghost, but the bullet simply bounced off the captain's already dead body, hitting the ghost of Sykes instead. Captain Edward then let out a roar and seemed to channel some sort of energy into Adina. The captain's ghost then possessed Adina's body, causing Brian to faint before leaving the ship. The lights on the ship suddenly went out, and everyone in the control room was forced to use their phone flashlights to see around them. Captain RHS screamed in fear as he saw a ghost, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it appeared, as if it had never been there. Suddenly, Adina, now possessed, burst into the room, attacking anyone who tried to stop her and taking control of the ship in accordance with Captain Edward's will. Captain RHS tried to persuade Captain Edward to stop, while his crew desperately tried to regain control of the ship, which was heading toward an iceberg, just like the Titanic before. Adina then approached Captain RHS, and to everyone's shock, slit her own throat. Her soul seemed to leave her body, but there was no time to react as the ship collided with the iceberg. The deck crew had to act quickly to save those still alive. Captain RHS urgently called for help, even more desperate than before. Professor Hal entered the room with Brian, but Sykes was nowhere to be found. He had met his demise. Professor Hal panicked upon seeing Adina's lifeless body and explained that he needed her body to fix the situation. Professor Hal claimed that all the relics must be returned to their rightful place. But Captain RHS disagreed, stating that the safety of the passengers was far more important than ending the curse. They focused on helping the passengers into the lifeboats. While Titanic 3 faced the same tragedy as the original Titanic, compounded by the presence of ghosts from the ship. Brian, obsessed with wealth, ignored his own safety and went to steal relics from the museum, but was stopped by Mia's ghost, who took control of his body and forced him to commit suicide. Julie then found Brian's body and mistakenly thought he was still alive, but soon realized too late the horror unfolding on the ship. The original Titanic model hanging in the room crashed down, killing her instantly. Professor Hal and Captain RHS continued to assist the passengers, but the ghosts were determined to prevent anyone from escaping, ensuring that everyone would be buried with them at the bottom of the ocean. The last remaining lifeboat was the one occupied by Professor Hal and Captain RHS. As they helped the passengers into the lifeboats, Professor Hal faced his worst nightmare in the form of Captain Edward Smith. In the end, Professor Hal and Captain RHS managed to secure a lifeboat for themselves and escape the sinking Titanic. 3. They believed there were still many others who had survived. Captain RHS cried as he realized that Professor Hal had been severely wounded and was dying. His tears turned into a scream of horror when Professor Hal transformed into a ghost and lunged at him.